Welcome back to Final Fantasy XIV Online. I'm Kumiko, and today we are starting Near Horizon, a small sanctuary in Western Thanalan, specifically the footfalls nearby. Much of the content here is largely hinged on being in the right place at the right time, and once the weather conditions really kick off, that's when it really matters, and so I end up shooting a lot of images in this video. So anyway, on with the content. This area, specifically in the footfalls, is absolutely rich with little vignettes and scenes that I feel many can easily overlook, and I hope to really do justice to this otherwise very small area between Horizon and Vesper Bay in Western Thanalan. What I love about this place is the interesting rock formations and what appears to be ruins of a previous civilization, a collision between the organic and inorganic, with curvature mixing with straight lines from handmade bricks. What I don't love about this place, however, is that there's so many small structures in a tiny place that makes it difficult to separate subjects from backgrounds and isolate subjects properly. I took a few days here, in real life and in-game, both, to work this area and figure out what sorts of compositions work, and where I can set up my camera angles and finding the correct and potential zoom ranges. So my first shot is aimed toward the horizon side, and I found this composition while traveling through here in the evening, Eorzean time. The artificial lighting along the footpath is what makes this composition, and it's about making that sense of movement and rhythm going from the foreground to the background. I knew that I wanted to include a portion of the foreground to lead into the image, but I also wanted to compress the image a bit. This meant going to a zoom of 175, around a 135 to 150mm full frame equivalent, keeping all of the lampposts in focus using a depth of field using f6.3, while also softening the tunnel in the background a tiny bit. Now, keep in mind that a full frame equivalent aperture value would be somewhere around f8 or f9 if you're shooting in the real world. So, why stand so far back and zoom in, and why quote-unquote compress the scene? Well, the concept here is to capture all of the lampposts within the same region of the frame, without separating them too far apart from each other. So for example, a shot taken physically closer and shot on a wider angle focal length will actually separate the lampposts from each other and also make the closer lamppost appear larger, separating it from the lamppost farther back in the image. Doing this separates them more from the background, but also separates them from each other, so you end up with multiple different elements, adding complexity to the scene. Standing farther back helps the lampposts to be much closer in size, so it's easier to see all four as a single large element. I took a vertical shot here to make sure I captured enough foreground while also capturing enough of the background, and then later cropped the image to figure out what works best. I eventually settled on a 4x5 crop to preserve enough space around the lampposts while also keeping them the focal point of the image. And with enough luck, here's the image on screen now. After taking this early morning pre-sunrise image, I then quickly went to my next composition, the Silent King. While an obvious fixture and subject for photography in the footfalls, the Silent King is actually rather one of the more difficult subjects to photograph properly. It took several hours in-game to figure out a good composition to properly capture the Silent King, but I did my homework and settled on an unorthodox method that even you, the viewer, can duplicate. If you enter G-pose, you can actually click on an NPC and see the world from their viewpoint. In this case, I clicked on Totoruna and took the image from their viewpoint. Is this cheating? I personally don't think so, as I am still fully in control of my focus and zoom settings, and this is the angle I would have chosen if Totoruna were not physically present anyway. But considering that I scouted this location earlier, I wanted the consistency of my camera location, so this is the easiest method of replicating my camera position. My intent here was to capture the grandeur of the Silent King while also framing it within the surrounding environment. A wide-angle image helps distort the edges of the frame and keeps in the contextual surroundings to the image. The natural rock formation along with the water and the sky act as a natural frame, and taking the image close to my subject here helps exaggerate the relative size against the ruins in the background. I decided on keeping all the elements here in focus, so I turned off depth of field so I can have sharp focus from front to back. It's important to capture the entire context of the scene if I'm going to include it. After photographing the Silent King, I figured that I had the entire rest of the day up until sunset to compose my next images properly and work with the late afternoon sunset lighting. But the weather decided something else for me: fog. This was actually a much better solution to the issue that I mentioned before with having too many elements in the frame. The Footfalls is full of natural rock formations, and with it being almost like a cave, the walls around the entire area end up being too distracting in clear weather conditions. Fog as an element really helps conceal the background that would otherwise distract the viewer. It becomes much easier to separate the individual subjects I want to isolate and really showcase. So here I stood near the water's edge of the footpath, looking toward Vesper Bay. A wide-angle composition would work excellently here in order to help create leading lines from the top and bottom of the composition, as the footpath itself is an excellent leading line along the bottom of the frame, and the rock above acts as an excellent mirrored framing element on the top of the frame. The only challenge here is finding where exactly to stand and to zoom and to use the fog to the fullest extent. Again, I want to obscure the distant rock walls while also keeping the rock formations here within clear enough view to make for an interesting subject with a good sense of flow to the image. I decided on a vertical composition here, and with the fog it changed up my previous scattered compositions and really simplified them. So I basically had to recompose all of my previous ideas and really work with different focal lengths. I eventually settled on camera position 0, or the full frame equivalent of about 16mm, with the full depth of field. And with the help of G-Shade, I was able to properly set my composition using the vertical preview tool. As much as I'd like to have placed my horizon line on the bottom third of my image, I had to resort to keeping my horizon dead center in order to preserve the vertical lines of the lampposts and avoid the sort of keystoning effect where they appear to lean inward to the center of the image. This ended up actually helping my composition by exaggerating the large leading line along the bottom of the frame and making a nice visual balance between the water on the left and the footpath on the right. I was able to separate the pillars of rock from the background as they were more like mid-ground elements. The plants in the foreground would need to be cropped out of the frame a bit so as to help keep the composition clean, and dealing with the ruins elements as well on the left helps balance the lamppost on the right just a bit. And here I felt okay keeping its base outside of the image because the viewer can assume that it's resting on something, which it actually is the case. I actually ended up keeping this composition in its entirety and without cropping. I knew the fog wasn't going to stay around forever, so I knew that I needed to work fast. Time in Eorzea passes much faster than in real life, so whenever you see a good composition, you have to go for it immediately. I then decided to go toward the Vesper Bay side of the Footfalls and look back toward the horizon side. On the opposite side of the Footfalls, the scene transforms quite a bit, so it's a very good idea to turn around and look backwards occasionally. However, framing the composition on this side was significantly more difficult. There are more rock pillars and much more complexity to the rocks above, and many more light posts. I still wanted to maintain the footpath as the main leading line along the bottom, and preserve the rocks above as well, but aligning all of the pillars among each other with the lampposts provided to be quite a challenge. I originally considered using a vertical composition as in the previous shot, but I found that a bit more of a quote-unquote controlled grand vista type of image was actually possible here. So I took a horizontal wide-angle shot with the idea of cropping down to a 2.4 by 1 panoramic. The shot is wide, but also controlled thanks to the fog, which helps obscure distant objects and textures in the background so that the general feel of the location still comes through in the image. I took the shot at a camera position of 0 or about a 16mm full frame equivalent. I turned depth of field off so you get the entire scene in focus from front to back. And here is the image on screen now. I then headed out to Western Thanalan in general in order to take advantage of the fog. This began a huge run of photos for running and gunning and hoping that I can get compositions that I scouted previously. When I first saw Western Thanalan, I knew that I had to capture at least a single tree or single cactus within a gigantic shot, and the challenge for doing so is absolutely immense, as there are no wide expanses of flat landscapes surrounding a single tree or a single cactus, so finding a composition like that is nearly impossible, considering that the entire landscape was actually not naturally generated, or at least as far as I know. Thanks to the fog, I isolated one single cactus in the distance and backed up just enough to set it against an entire foggy backdrop using portrait orientation and a zoom of around 200, or around a 135 to 150mm full frame equivalent. I took the shot, and here it is. When conditions are this good for isolating subjects, I ran everywhere I could to try to find any better potential compositions and other potential trees or cacti, but considering that the weather changes about every 8 hours in Eorzea, I don't have the luxury of really working scenes for too long, so I had to simply run and look left and right. I didn't find any other clean compositions of trees or cacti, and I ended up at the Silver Bazaar docks nearby and captured a tiny and solitary sea stack. I really like texture in the sea stack and the water in this frame, zoomed to 125 and also in portrait orientation. This composition ended up almost abstract-ish in a way, as there are no foreground or background, just the water and the rock itself. I took the shot, here it is. After taking a picture of that sea stack, I then considered, well, trying to look around, see if I could find something around the Silver Bazaar area, or just continuing to find a possible tree or cactus composition to replace a previous one, but time really was not on my side. I only have 8 hours total, so I knew where I wanted to go next. So I ended up finding the West Hammer as well, although this composition did require a little working, considering that I had to take this image while looking uphill, just slightly. As an intricate piece of architecture, I also had to keep the horizon, the actual horizon, in the center of my frame, and doing so required that the hammer take up only about a third of the entire frame, which meant that I had to do some serious cropping to get the proper perspective without distorting it too much. I had to use a zoom of 50, meaning taking a wide angle shot of around 24mm-ish full frame, much wider than what I'd like to take, but time was running out and it was better to secure the shot and worry about the processing later, provided that the framing was good enough. So with enough luck, here it is. As soon as I took that shot, the fog started to clear, so I knew that my time was up. I headed back into doing some main scenario quests, which took me ultimately back to Old Da. I somehow wandered near the Gate of Thal on the eastern side during sunrise. The morning mist was illuminated in the sun's rays as they shone through the arches, so I started up G-Pose quickly and snapped this photo. I knew that I wanted to do a 1x1 photo composition. Here it is. And with that, I continued the main scenario. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.